What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Fantasy Football Fellas YouTube channel. My name is Tyler Plath, and the fellas are back from their weekend getaway in Miami with our friends over at Underdog Fantasy. We had a great time kicking it back and chilling out with our friends over there, but we are now back with our regularly scheduled programming of Waiver Wire Monday. And Week 14 is virtually complete. We just have 2 games left on Monday Night Football, and then we are on to Week 15 and the start of fantasy playoffs. So now's the time for all of those last-minute reinforcements that we may need on our teams, and these guys in this video certainly meet that criteria. So before I begin, make sure you're subscribed and have that notification bell turned on so you stay up to date on everything football as we go into fantasy playoffs. Let's get it started with Bears running back D'Onta Foreman. We talked about his teammate Roschon Johnson in last week's episode after he dominated touches in the Bears backfield in week 12. And that was a game that D'Onta Foreman missed. And in week 14, with all 3 running backs healthy, it was D'Onta Foreman who stepped up and got the call as the lead back after he took 56% of the team snaps to Roschon's 27% and Khalil Herbert's 17%. And D'Onta Foreman had 42% of the team's rushing attempts, and he ran double the amount of routes of Roschon and Khalil Herbert. Foreman has a tough matchup next week against Cleveland, but then he gets 2 exploitable matchups against Arizona and Atlanta in fantasy playoffs. He should be the top ad this week, especially if this backfield is going to go the way that it did in week 14. If you're looking for a running back, D'Onta Foreman is your guy. And if he isn't available, you could also look for Vikings running back Ty Chandler. And we've talked quite a bit about Ty Chandler in recent weeks on this channel, but there's a legit possibility that he sees more work in future weeks. The one thing that's been holding Chandler back is Alexander Mattison. And Mattison, unfortunately, left the game in week 14 with an ankle injury and didn't return. And from that point on, it was the Ty Chandler show. So if Mattison misses any time in the future, Ty Chandler instantly becomes a viable starting option with matchups against Cincinnati and Green Bay in the horizon. We don't know how long Alexander Mattison's injury will keep him out for. Heck, he could be back next week for all we know. But there's major opportunity for Ty Chandler to give you solid fantasy production in Mattison's potential absence. If you're looking for wide receiver help, Odell Beckham Jr. may be your guy. Odell went for 4 receptions for 97 yards and a tutty in week 14, but he also saw 10 targets, and that is a number that should catch your attention. If we look over the last 3 weeks for Baltimore in Mark Andrews' absence, and I'm including week 11, the game that Mark Andrews got hurt, because he got hurt fairly early in the game, Odell has had 2 games with at least 97 receiving yards, and he still leads the team in targets per route run by a wide margin, big margin, more than double the next guy, which is Zay Flowers. The Ravens' next 3 games go Jacksonville, San Francisco, and Miami, which sounds like points to me in all of those games. Odell may not be someone that you start in your lineup every week, but with the matchups that he has and the high-scoring games that those can be, he's one of the best depth pieces to have. So if you're looking for a wide receiver, Odell Beckham Jr. might be your guy, and if it's not Odell, then it's probably going to be Texans wide receiver Noah Brown. We talked about him last week as the team's new wide receiver 2 because of Tank Dell's injury, which also meant that Nico Collins was going to be their number 1 guy moving forward, but he left with an injury in week 14 and was ruled out by halftime. Now, we don't know the extent of his injury either, but if he were to miss any time, Noah Brown becomes the most intriguing name to roster from the Houston Texans. And there's something to be said, too, about Robert Woods and, heck, even John Mechie, because they'll likely see an increased role in Tank Dell and Nico Collins' absence. But Noah Brown is then the guy. Now, C.J. Stroud also left this game with a concussion, so we'll see what his status is like moving forward. But then the quarterback is Davis Mills. I don't know if Noah Brown is then the most startable player, but Noah Brown is still the wide receiver 1 on the team and is at least worth stashing away, because when C.J. Stroud comes back, there's fantasy points to be had then for Noah Brown. Jerick McKinnon is the next guy we'll discuss, and there was an interesting update over the weekend about the health of Isaiah Pacheco and his shoulder, where it was reported that he was an IR candidate, but then it was reported that it was not that serious, but it's still a week-to-week, day-by-day thing at best kind of scenario. So in Pacheco's absence in Week 14, Jerick McKinnon saw a season high in usage and got goal line work and found the end zone once en route to a running back 17 finish before Monday Night Football. This really comes down to rostering one of the best weapons, because outside of Travis Kelce and Rashee Rice at this point, there's really no one else on one of the best offenses in the league. So as long as Isaiah Pacheco remains out, Jerick McKinnon will continue to see the kind of utilization that he saw in Week 14. But this backfield didn't completely go to Jerick McKinnon. Rather, it was a complete split with Clyde Edwards-Helaire, who should also be targeted on waivers this week. And what was a 48-45 split in snaps according to Matthew Berry's Fantasy Life, CEH saw the bulk of carries and virtually ran the same amount of routes and had the same amount of targets as Jerick McKinnon. So while McKinnon was the one who found the end zone near the goal line, I don't think that's McKinnon's role for the rest of the season or for as long as Isaiah Pacheco is out. And that could very well be CEH at some points, again, in Isaiah Pacheco's absence. We know what this backfield will look like when Isaiah Pacheco misses time. It is going to be a split between Jerick McKinnon and CEH. So if you have Pacheco, I'd highly recommend going and getting either one of these guys as insurance to just have some safety options. But also, if you don't have Pacheco, there's some value. There's some standalone value for Jerick McKinnon and Clyde Edwards-Helaire. So go look for those guys if you are out of running back options. We got 5 more players, so let's not waste any more of your time and talk about Chase Brown, who has come onto the scene over the last 2 weeks. After little to no work the first 12 weeks of the season, he saw 9 carries in Week 13 against the Jacksonville Jaguars and had an increased role in Week 14. He had over 100 scrimmage yards and found the end zone in Week 14, and he's officially overtaken Travion Williams as the third down back, as the passing down back. But he is still clearly the backup to Joe Mixon, who is still getting all the early down and short yardage work. But Chase Brown has been involved enough the last couple weeks to warrant some kind of consideration, and if you have Joe Mixon, you'd be smart to stash away Brown just in case we see any work that currently belongs to Joe Mixon go over to Chase Brown over the next couple weeks. And someone else to stash away is Rico Dowdle, especially if you have Tony Pollard as we head into fantasy playoffs. Irks me to no end, but that's where we're at this year in fantasy football. Mike McCarthy was on one again in Week 14 as Dowdle had 8 carries to Tony Pollard's 6 in the first half. And Rico Dowdle got a goal line snap and found the end zone on it, which irked me, but again, that's where we are at. Now, Pollard still led in touches over the duration of the game. Pollard had 16 carries and 7 receptions, so 23 touches to what I believe was 12, 13, maybe 14 touches from Rico Dowdle. But there's a shift now to a 2-man committee in terms of rushing attempts in this Dallas offense. The Cowboys' running back schedule isn't the most favorable schedule moving forward, but with this recent shift to the 2-man committee in rushing attempts, Rico Dowdle has some standalone value, should be stashed away, especially if you have Tony Pollard. 3 wide receivers left on this list, starting with Zay Jones, who saw a whopping 14 targets, but only pulled in 5 of them for 29 yards in Week 14. Christian Kirk landed on the IR after their Week 13 game against Cincinnati and is likely to miss the rest of the regular season, if not the playoffs. So that led to more work for Zay Jones. And 14 targets is a lot. And Trevor Lawrence having 50 passing attempts is also a lot. So I don't think we'll see those kind of numbers every single week, but it's notable to say the least. And the numbers that matter, like routes and targets, increased for Zay Jones. And that's what we wanted to see in Kirk's absence. So that gives Zay Jones some kind of value in the weeks ahead. The Panthers are a tough team to bet on in fantasy football because they don't score much. And because of that, they don't put up a whole lot of fantasy points. but Jonathan Mingo may be emerging as this team's wide receiver one. Since moving on from Frank Reich 2 weeks ago, Jonathan Mingo has led the team in routes ran and targets ahead of Adam Thielen, which is notable when you remember that Adam Thielen is the wide receiver 14 on the year. You're unlikely to play any Panthers player the rest of the season besides Chuba Hubbard in certain matchups. And yes, that also means you're unlikely to play Adam Thielen. But Mingo is probably the wide receiver one moving forward, or for at least the rest of the season, and there's some value associated with that. And lastly, Demarcus Robinson of the Rams has been the wide receiver 18 over the last 2 weeks, averaging 14.5 fantasy points per game. It's helped that he scored in both games, so that's something to remember. But he did see 10 targets in Week 14, which at least makes you wonder and consider if this recent stretch of games isn't just a fluke and that Robinson is actually going to be more involved moving forward and down the stretch when the Rams need wins because they are in the hunt in the NFC playoff picture. He's an intriguing option if you're in a deeper league with 14 or 16 people or you have multiple flex spots in your starting lineups or something along those lines. The Rams, like I said, in the hunt in the playoff picture in must-win games, have a schedule of Washington, New Orleans, and the Giants. Winnable games for the Rams, and they've been winning through the air recently. So that gives, again, some intrigue for Demarcus Robinson that this recent stretch isn't just a fluke, that there's actually something behind it. And that'll do it. Your top waiver wire ads for Week 15 and the guys that we talked about in this video. Deonta Foreman, Ty Chandler, Odell Beckham Jr., Noah Brown, the Chiefs running backs, Jerick McKinnon and Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Chase Brown, Rico Dowdle, Zay Jones, Jonathan Mingo, and Demarcus Robinson. Little longer of a list than usual, so if you made it to this point, appreciate you doing that. Go ahead and give this video a like if you made it to this point. And if you have any other waiver wire, start sit questions, go ahead and drop them in the comments below, and we will be there answering them as they come in. Fantasy playoffs are here, so hit that subscribe button. Have that notification bell turned on so you don't miss any important tips, advice, and updates we will have for you on this channel. We'll see you on the next episode of the Fantasy Football Fellas podcast that comes out tomorrow. So until then, deuces.